about this new book, and actually an old book of mine because it's related to the birth of this book and the birth of this company, and kind of talk about the ideas in this book in the context of Outside In and the history here. So both Good Ideas and Outside In date back to this book that I wrote in 2005 and 2006 called The Ghost Map. And the Ghost Map was a story about this outbreak of cholera in the 19th century in London. It's a true story. And it is about basically the process by which people solved the kind of mystery of where cholera was coming from, which the authorities believed was in the air at the time. Of course, we now know that cholera was in the water. And so it was this kind of interesting story that I kept colliding with from different angles, right? I would hear about it as a great story of scientific discovery and triumph. I would hear it as a great story of kind of public health interventions, a great story in the history of city planning, and actually a great story in the history of information design. Tufte's famous books about visualizing information included this story because at the center of it there's a map that was made, and so it's a kind of classic moment in cartography and information design as well. So anytime you keep encountering some interesting anecdote or field or story from different angles, that's a sign that something interesting is happening. It's a kind of, it's almost like the way that Google calculates relevance. Like when you see a lot of inbound links from different directions to the same thing, there's something kind of intellectually interesting about it, and it's worth following it. So I thought this was a really interesting story. At the time, the way I heard it was basically that there was this terrible outbreak in London in the 1850s. In Soho there, 10% of the neighborhood died in 10 days. And in the middle of this outbreak, this kind of visionary scientist and doctor, John Snow, goes into the middle of the disease area that's where people are dying, and literally like pulling the corpses through the streets, and starts knocking on people's doors, investigating who's died and who hasn't died. And he built a map of all the deaths, and the map, in each residence, there's a little kind of black bar for each death. And so you can see where the disease is kind of clustering. You see 10 people died at this address, 5 people died at this address, 1 person died here. And when you look at the map, you can see this very clear cluster of deaths right around this public watering hole, this old pump at 40 Broad Street in the middle of Soho where people would get their water. And so Snow looks at the map and says, aha, people are getting sick because they're drinking from this pump. The problem with cholera must be in the water. And not in the air. The authorities have it all wrong. He goes to the authorities and convinces them of his theory. They shut down the pump. The disease stops. The authorities come around to his theory. They build the London sewers, clean up the water supply, and cholera leaves London 10 years later, never to return again. That was how I had been told the story. And I thought, that's a great story. It'll be like a Victorian episode of CSI. Like people were like the detective and the thriller and stuff like that. And so I started working on it, and it turned out, once I started researching the book, it turned out that almost every major fact that I just told you was wrong. And in fact, the first thing I found out was that Snow did not have this epiphany looking at the map. He did not suddenly look at the map and say, I figured out where the cholera was coming from. He'd actually been working on that theory for about 8 years before the outbreak actually happened. And he had this kind of hunch that people had it wrong. He'd started working on this idea that maybe it was in the water, not in the air. And he'd written a number of papers, had done a number of other maps actually, trying to make the case. He published a bunch of letters in the Lancet, and he couldn't get anyone to come around to his idea. And so it wasn't until this outbreak and this particular map that he was able to kind of convince people. It was more like the map was a marketing vehicle for his idea. It was not a sudden epiphany, a moment of great clarity for him. The other thing it turned out is that Snow had all these different interests, and it was precisely because he had all these different interests. I mean, cholera was just a kind of hobby of his. He was a doctor. Most of us don't have cholera as a hobby, thankfully. He was a physician, but he got into all these other things. He got into anesthesiology just as kind of a hobby. He was doing all this kind of epidemiology on the sources of cholera as a side project, but making his living as a doctor. And it actually turned out to be that the kind of diversity of his interests helped him in a number of different ways to put him in a position where he could have this idea that the authorities were all wrong. But the biggest thing that I discovered was that he had a collaborator that no one had ever written about. And this collaborator was this guy, Henry Whitehead, who was a local vicar, who was not a man of science at all, but was one of these classic kind of social connectors who knew everybody in the neighborhood, was the kind of vicar who was hanging out late at night at the pub with everybody drinking, into the middle of the night. But he got kind of interested in the case, in part because he disagreed with Snow's theory, because he had drunk a lot of water from this pump as well. And so he started kind of doing a parallel investigation, and ended up kind of coming around to Snow's theory. And Whitehead, because he knew everybody, was able to track down a lot of the cases, particularly people who left the neighborhood. And Whitehead actually ended up finding the index case, the patient zero of the outbreak that got sick in the first place. And so it was this real collaboration between these two guys who had totally different interests, sensibilities, personal kind of temperaments. And it was through their interaction and through their kind of sharing of talents that they were able to kind of solve this. So I realized as I was writing the book that there was kind of this latent theory about innovation that was happening as I was writing the book. That it was not about an epiphany. It was not about a lone genius. It was about a particular kind of set of talents across a kind of a network of people in a very specific space, in a neighborhood, at a particular point in time. And it was not about an epiphany. It was about a kind of a long gestational period for an idea. And so I started to think, well, maybe here's this kind of theory about innovation, which is a pretty interesting topic. Maybe I can take that and put it front and center in a book and really write about that theory and write about the environments that lead to unusually innovative thinking. Now, the funny thing about that, in the context of Outside In, is as I was writing that book, a couple things were happening around me as I was doing the research for this book. I'm kind of living mentally in the 19th century, writing about this neighborhood, writing about maps, writing about the power of local communities, writing about seeing patterns in the behavior of local communities, in this case the behavior of dying, but nonetheless mapping kind of patterns of behavior. And the kind of procrastination device that I had during that period when I would sit down with a cup of coffee to start working on the book was I would go and start looking at all these local blogs that were starting to sprout up in Brooklyn. Brown Stoner and Only the Blog Knows Brooklyn and a few others, and Curved here in Manhattan that had just started around that time. And Google had just released the Maps API, and so people were starting to do these interesting little mapping mashups that were happening that were pretty easy. And so the combination of this 19th century disease book, a new technology platform that had just been made public, and then this new form of communication that was happening with local bloggers, writing about my neighborhood, my community in a way that really no one had written before, right? They were writing about all the stuff that was happening on a block-by-block level that really had never been covered by the New York Times before, or even, a big Brooklyn paper wasn't really covering that kind of granular level. And so I started to think that maybe there was some interesting combination of all those interests, and maybe it would be possible to kind of put together some service that would organize all those different sources and put them on a map, actually. Maps were a lot more central to the original vision of this than they are now. And aggregate and curate, and we could put something together. And so, for a long time I had that idea, which was very much this kind of cross-disciplinary idea that came from writing about something totally different. But I kind of suppressed it for a while because I really did not want to disrupt my lifestyle. Like, I had this really nice lifestyle where I was writing books, I was home, was about to have a baby, my third kid, and I was eating lunch with my wife every day, and I was giving speeches, so I was traveling a little bit, and I had basically eliminated meetings from my life altogether, which was very nice. And so I didn't tell anybody about this idea, and then it turns out I ended up having lunch with Andy Karsh and Mark Bailey, who some of you have met, our co-founders and board members. And somehow over conversation I mentioned this idea to both of them, and Andy, to his great credit, said, "That's an awesome idea, I'll give you $50,000 to build a prototype, you should totally do that." And so then I thought, oh, damn, that was somebody else's money, I guess I kind of have to do it. And so I got together with John Geraci and Corey Forsythe, who a number of you know, and we built a little prototype over the summer, and then we got to a point where we could drag the Google map, and when we dragged, as we moved it from one neighborhood to the other, the page would refresh, and we would see different stories from different sources based on what we were looking at on the map. And the second we saw that, we were like, oh, now we really have to do that. Like, this is cool. Like, nobody can do this right now. Even Google doesn't do this, and we just did it in 2 months. And so we were off to the races. So GhostMap is actually at the birth of both this company and Good Ideas. What Good Ideas eventually then I had to take a leave from writing Good Ideas, which somewhat upset my publisher, and I was like, I'm going to start an internet company if that's all right. So you got to give me a year. I've written 3 books in 3 years. So I was like, people are going to get sick of me. So let me just do do a little startup stuff and I'll come back. So anyway, good ideas. When I finally sat down to write it, it was a little daunting because I knew that I wanted not only to look at environments that historically led to innovation and creative thinking, both on the level of organizations, and the level of buildings, and the level of neighborhoods, and the level of media environments and platforms. But I also was interested in biological environments, to look at kind of environments in nature that lead to a lot of innovation, to a lot of biodiversity, because I thought there were probably some shared patterns to find in places like coral reefs and tropical rainforests to generate a lot of interesting new forms of life. And so I knew that that was going to be the kind of thrust of the book. But then I realized that I had set the potential scope of this project like ridiculously wide, because it could basically, when I'm trying to figure out what should I put in this book, it could include any good idea that any human being had ever had over the course of human history, and any interesting life form that had ever evolved over the course of life on Earth. So like, sitting there with a cup of coffee trying to start writing, it was pretty forbidding. But I ended up, after a while of stalling, and actually writing another book that was kind of a stall as well, I ended up realizing that I was seeing these kind of recurring patterns in all the stories that I was tracking down. And I finally decided that the way to structure the book was to organize it where each pattern was its own chapter. And then once I had the kind of 5 of the patterns, it ended up being 7, it got a lot easier to kind of write, because the patterns became these kind of magnets that attracted all the different stories. And so I had a real structure. So I thought I'd tell you about a couple of them that I think maybe are relevant here. And one of them is, we already saw in the case of Jon Snow, and it's what I call in the book the slow hunch. And the idea of the slow hunch is that while it's wonderful to tell stories of innovation in terms of breakthrough epiphanies and eureka moments, it's almost always a myth. It's almost always, when you go back and look at the kind of real story of where the idea came from, it's preceded by a long period of kind of incubation. That the idea really starts with this kind of hunch, this feeling that there's something interesting, there's a problem that can be solved, or there's a new opportunity for something that can take you in a new direction. But you can't quite put your finger on it, you're not sure quite what it is, but you've got an inkling of something. And people who end up being innovative, and organizations that end up being innovative, are good at keeping those hunches alive. And they keep them alive by writing them down in their notebooks, by revisiting those notebooks, by creating spaces in the organization where people can kind of tinker with these ideas, and oftentimes by creating spaces where these ideas can kind of collide with each other. Because often what happens is the hunch needs to find another hunch that's sitting in somebody else's mind, and it's through putting these two things together that the idea really becomes powerful. And there's a great example of that in the platform that we're all dependent on, the World Wide Web. When Tim Berners-Lee started working on the web in 1982, he was like a temp at CERN and at the physics lab in Switzerland. And he got there and was kind of overwhelmed with all the information, all the people, all the different projects that were going on there, all the scientific papers. And so, as a side project, he didn't even tell his superiors about this, he started working on this thing which he originally called Inquire. And he built a little program to kind of manage all this information. And he tinkered with it for about 2 years, and he put it away. And then a year or two later, he started working on something called Tangle, which was almost, the web was almost called Tangle, which is pretty funny. Probably a better name in some ways now.